The race is on, and while Mercedes has dominated the early stages of the season, Ferrari has been able to cause it some problems. So what chances are there of it being able to close the gap in time to get into title contention? And at what tracks might it have a chance of being able to beat the Silver Arrows? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer those questions and many more are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Josh Suttill. Well, today we're going to take questions from our listeners, specifically members of the Race Members Club. And remember, we've got a 90% off your first month special offer. More on that later in the podcast. But let's pile straight into it with Scott and Josh. So, Scott, the first question for you from Dylan Clifford. Is there enough evidence so far to suggest that Ferrari have the best chassis? Could we see the Ferrari potentially being the car to beat at tracks such as Hungary?
Well, George Russell wouldn't like the premise of that question. He's quite adamant that Mercedes has also built the best car, not just the best engine. But the problem with answering it definitively is the weird way that they have to drive the cars in qualifying. So I don't really think we can say with any certainty over the first two qualifying sessions that we've seen the very best of all the cars in the corners, which would be where I would make the judgment to answer this question and say who's got the best chassis. What I would say is that the Ferrari car, I don't think looks any worse than the Mercedes. I think it's got some really lovely strengths on the engine and the car side. It's clearly. Well, I say clearly, again, we just don't really know with the mess of the restarts, for example, how much of a factor this is, but it looks like it's really good at switching the tyres on. It does look like a nice, nimble, sharp car on the front end. One of the things that stood out to me in the first couple of races is just how agile the Ferrari does seem to look, especially in battle. It's always a bit tricky when you've got two of the same car racing each other, because I guess that kind of negates some of the weaknesses you might see otherwise. But the way that the Ferraris could race in China, for example, the way that they put pressure on the Mercedes, the way they picked off George Russell at the safety car restart there, does tell me that that's it's quite a raceable car, which I think is good. And I don't see any obvious vices in it. Whereas I think previous years we have seen the Ferrari, it can have a really strong front end, but that comes at the cost of being inconsistent and looking a little bit wobbly at the rear, and the instability on the rear looks unpredictable or particularly excessive. I don't get that impression at all. So I think it's to sort of paraphrase Hamilton, I think it's a really nice foundational car. It looks like it could be a very, very good, maybe the best chassis if they develop it well.
And because you said it's nimble, it feels like it could be quite effective at Hungary, could be quite effective at Monaco, especially with a small turbo. So there's definitely, feels like some circuits where it can be, I think, even more potent. It feels like to me, Ferrari think a lot of the deficit is on the engine side, because as we mentioned on the post-race podcast, Fred Vasseur on Sunday felt like Ferrari's engine was at least 2% down on the Mercedes, because he felt like they were going to be able to get an upgrade at the first opportunity for the additional development upgrade opportunity will be happening in May, where you have to have your engine 2% down. So clearly, I think Vasseur, didn't say it absolutely really strongly, but seemed to hint that he thinks at least the engine is 2% down. So surely then the chassis can't be too bad. He seems to think that most of the deficit there is at least on the engine side.
Well, I was going to say, just applying some basic mathematics to that equation, presumably the Ferrari chassis is about 1.2% better than the Mercedes is, because if you've got to be 2% or more behind on the internal combustion engine index that the FIA puts together to be eligible for these upgrades that Vasseur seems to think rather than hope that Ferrari will get, but they're about 0.8, 0.9% off in China qualifying, so the chassis flying if the engine's that far off.
Josh, I have to admonish you for using the full wording for ADUO, because as you know, this is Formula One, so acronyms must be used and not explained at all times. But yeah, I asked Fred Vasseur after the race on Sunday, do you think you've got enough evidence to say you've got the best chassis? Now, while he's not the sort of person who would shoot his mouth off and shout about that sort of thing, he did make a very good point, which is, well, actually, it's quite difficult to untangle the chassis performance from the power unit performance. And the question is, because those tracks you cited, Josh, like the Monacos, the Hungarys, that kind of thing, they're the obvious ones. But you don't know where the Mercedes will go in terms of how it operates in those conditions. So you could say there's kind of a hint that would be the case, but we just don't know enough about the performance profiles of these current cars to be absolutely sure. But what I would say is there is hope that could be the case. And I say hope from the perspective of everybody who wants to see evenly matched cars fighting at the front of the field.
And it's obviously different. There's different ways of winning a race and being the best car at the right time or on the day, because it does look like as a package, Ferrari's a long way off just beating Mercedes in a straight fight from lap 1 to the final lap after qualifying at fastest as well. That's going to be a tall order this season, but it might be possible if there are circuits that lean towards the Ferrari package more and, nice development on car and engine side brings them more into the picture. But on the evidence of the first 2 races, I'd be stunned if Ferrari don't win a Grand Prix this season, because I just think all of the things that make that package good and all of the things that can leave the Mercedes vulnerable in certain situations, law of averages tells me it's more likely than not that will come together in a way that puts Ferrari ahead at the right time at some point over the course of the year. Because if even if it's as simple as being the second best team consistently, getting a late safety car and just being stronger on safety car restarts, being quick enough to gain track position and then quick enough to make a really good go of staying there. You don't need that much of an opportunity at the end of a race with a nicely timed safety car. If you can get track position at one of those tight, twisty circuits that we're talking about and in the question, then yeah, that's a great opportunity to stay ahead, because track position might not be king in the same way that it has been in the past, but it's not going to fix everything when we go to certain circuits where it's difficult to get back by. So I don't know how likely it is that Ferrari will have like the benchmark package properly at some point this year. But right now, surely the smart money is on Ferrari to win a race at some point.
It would be a surprise. Ultimately, I think they're pretty likely to win races by just consistently being the second quickest car, as they were in China and Australia, because things are going to go wrong for Mercedes at times, aren't they? We saw this in 2014 when they had dominant package and they missed out on 3 wins, each of which was taken by Red Bull, because Red Bull happened to be the one on those days that was second best. You could argue that actually Williams missed out on being that, but Ferrari consistently has been best of the rest so far, and who knows what the development war might yield. But Josh, on a related note, are we early enough in this regulation set to believe Ferrari can close the gap to Mercedes through in-season development? Or should we hand the Constructors' Championship trophy over to Mercedes now? That question was from Eric Bryant.
Yeah, definitely far too early to be handing the Constructors or Drivers' Championship to anybody. And I say that not just because we're so early in the season, but because we're 2 races into a huge regulation change on both the car and the power unit. You even only have to look at the 3rd or 4th year of the ground effect era to see that we saw huge swings in performance in the pecking order. It had been way too early to hand the title to McLaren in 25 and way too early to hand the title to Red Bull in 24. So yeah, absolutely too early. And also, we're going to get an absolutely, potentially monumental reset in Miami, because now there's no Bahrain and Saudi. There's a huge gap. There's, I think, 33 days between the Japanese Grand Prix and the first day of the Miami weekend. So a big gap, and all the teams they're already working hard, but they're going to be working extra hard during that gap to bring something to Miami. A lot of the top teams are targeting a significant package there. And that's got huge chance of resetting the pecking order, really, because you've got 2 elements. You've got the chassis upgrades that they'll bring, because really a lot of the teams have yet to kind of fully tap into that. They've been so busy working on the power units. A team like McLaren has admitted, it's just behind on good old-fashioned downforce to Mercedes, because it's been so focused on getting the most out of the Mercedes power unit. So you've got all the stuff on the chassis side, which feels completely kind of untapped so far. And then, of course, you've got the power unit gains as well, where we're going to see natural development of getting the most out of them and exploiting what they do have. But then we're also going to see the potential engine upgrades from ADIO. Is that right, Ed? Is that the right acronym? ADIO?
I go through ADUO, ADUO.
ADUO, sorry, not ADIO. Yeah. Okay, we'll see who says adios. Whatever the acronym. But yeah, there is going to be the engine upgrades as well, which are going to then potentially change the pecking order as well. So many different factors. I think really we're going to have to wait to see Miami for that to shake out. and then to see how it shakes out over those next few races. So yeah, I would say, especially given we've lost 2 of the races where the pecking order is set. And one more thing, throw in the compression ratio tests that are going to be coming in from June the 1st as well. So many different factors, but yeah, it's way too early.
Yeah, what is clear is that Mercedes are very strong favourites. We're not trying to say that they're not or confect a title fight where there isn't one, but we are going to see the goalposts move so much in terms of relative performance that we can't just say 100% it's going to be this way throughout. You've got the compression ratio change kicking in at the start of June. I don't think that's going to be the inconvenience to Mercedes that Mercedes rivals might have once hoped it was going to be honest, but that is still another parameter that is changing down the line that can have an impact on things.
Yeah, and for Ferrari as well, of course, remember that, 4 years ago, the last regulation cycle, they came out with more or less the best car, pretty much, I guess, level with Red Bull, and then Red Bull was able to accelerate that development so much that they weren't a factor really by the end of the season in terms of the title race. So yeah, really interested to see what any of those 4 top teams can do. I feel like I couldn't rule any of them out. And yeah, it's going to be who develops the best, because we know Ferrari can come out with a strong car at the start of the season, as they have so many times. And it looks like they've got a really, really good platform, as we've said, with no real vices, a proper kind of good starting point. I guess the question will be, can this time they make consistent, accurate mid-season developments that keeps them in the race? Because they weren't really able to do that in any of the 4 years of the ground effect era consistently over an entire year.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily bet the farm on Ferrari being able to do that, even in 24, where they challenged for the Constructors' Championship. They had that huge lull in the middle of the season that arguably did cost them the Constructors' title. But I think you're absolutely right not to write off McLaren and Red Bull entirely at this stage, despite their position. That connects to the next question I'll take from Irene Kreemans, who says, last year Red Bull decided to develop their car until late in the season. This year their car lacks pace, and a big part of that is coming from the chassis. Do you think this is the result of switching the 2026 development so late? And Michael Horner asked a similar question, but included Ferrari in that, and Sean Cole's another one to fire in a question on that sort of area. Yeah, I think it's part of the picture. Red Bull were probably at the more extreme end because they were doing a lot of troubleshooting on their car later. So I think they consumed more development resources than McLaren did on 25, and maybe McLaren did a little bit more than, say, Mercedes and Ferrari did, ultimately, given their position in the championship. So I think it's part of the picture. However, I doubt it's the biggest single factor. There's multiple things. Obviously, Red Bull have the power unit, which is part of it as well. The power unit's pretty impressive, but it's not a Mercedes. And then, yeah, car limitations for the Red Bull are pretty clear. But you can't necessarily say it's 100% down to that, because, yes, you're limited on wind tunnel and CFD development time. Anything you use on 25 last year couldn't be used on 26 with that steep learning curve. So it's part of the picture, but you also need to have the right ideas, fundamentals, concepts. Plus, of course, with McLaren, there's the additional thing of, the power unit management and energy regime that we know Mercedes was ahead on, although that gap has been closed. And now, by McLaren's own admission, the chassis is a bigger part of their deficit. They're definitely lacking a bit of aerodynamic load. There's a hint they might be lacking a little bit of stability under braking, which doesn't help with the harvesting. But Scott, this is a good example of where we are now, isn't it? Because the picture just isn't entirely clear. I don't think even the teams themselves could articulate fully the performance profiles and really get to the bottom of the reasons for those, because they need more time to work with the cars, and they just need more data and knowledge of cars on different circuits to really understand where things are and what's actually got them to this position.
Yeah, especially when you consider that the Australia and China weekends were so different, format-wise, but also completely different circuits too. I think it was a cliche for quite a long time, where you'd start to hear teams in the last few years talk about how kind of every race at the start of the season was an anomaly, because you'd go to this track and it would be this and this and this and this, and it always just felt a little bit put on, part of that kind of baseless F1 paranoia and caution at committing to a position or saying the wrong thing. But this year it holds true. We came away from Bahrain, where not only was it one type of circuit, but teams had 6 days there to get everything really nice and tailored and optimized for that venue. You go to Australia, one of the worst of the season in terms of energy management demand. So everybody focuses everything they've got on that pretty much. Then you go to China, other end of the spectrum in terms of energy management side, but a sprint weekend. So you've got way less time on track doing your relevant kind of checks. I think it was Komatsu at Haas who said in Australia you were trying to do in like one run what you would spend an entire afternoon doing in Bahrain. Well, that then got condensed even further in China. And now we're going to go to Suzuka after a small amount of time for debriefing on the data gain from the first 2 weekends. But you have this other demand now where there's a huge element of chassis demand in the first sector at Suzuka, but the energy management demands of that circuit means do you need to set your car up for the first sector at all anymore, because you're just going to be coasting through there as much as possible or super clipping through there as much as possible to save energy? I would be stunned if any team right now really knows where to pitch their car ideally and kind of exactly where they stand on chassis versus engine pecking order. Like GPS data will be really helpful to strip certain things out. But if you end up with a situation where teams are kind of changing the way that they're doing things on energy management, charging, deployment, what they're willing to compromise on the car side in pursuit of managing the battery better and so on and so forth, I really struggled to see how they've got any relevant kind of back-to-back tests that they've done to be able to definitively say this is the best window in which we operate our car, and if every car ran to the absolute maximum on this theoretical circuit, this is where we would shake out. And I obviously we don't have Bahrain and Saudi now, so that uncertainty is going to rumble on even longer. But I genuinely think you could have got into the European season on a normal calendar and gone, I don't really know who's got the best car at the front or the best car in the midfield, and I imagine it would be a similar degree of uncertainty in the teams, or they'll obviously be orders of magnitude better informed in terms of how they then realise we don't know this.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame Bahrain's gone from that regard, because they had all the data from pre-season testing plus the knowledge from the first few races, so that might have been an interesting measure. But yeah, it's going to take a little bit of time for the reasons and the real performance patterns and all those kinds of things to shake out. But we'll gradually get there over the year, filling up the knowledge bucket, as I like to call it. Right, let's move on to some more questions. Scott, a question from David Walton. Does Toto Wolff still have the hots for Max Verstappen? And if so, who will he bin off for the aggrieved Dutchman? England's Rose or the Italian Stallion? Not sure about the nicknames there. I tend to think of them more as the head boy and the schoolboy, to be honest.
George Russell as the head boy has definitely become like a well-established in-joke now, just for a really long time in terms of just everything. Just everything. There's not one specific thing I can point to. I think Wolff and Mercedes definitely have a champagne problem, don't they? There, like if Verstappen wants out at Red Bull and is still interested in potentially going to Mercedes, and Wolff still wants him because he's obviously the best driver in Formula One still. He's not the world champion, and he's not going to be the world champion this year, I imagine. But I don't think that changes kind of if everyone's on an even playing field. I think Max still does have the edge, but it's never that straightforward a question, especially as the differences between Verstappen and the other amazing drivers right at the top of the pecking order is very minor, and he won't be the best across everything either. So then you can then weigh that up against the other things. So longevity with people like Russell, teamwork, ability to work with a teammate, reputation, what they're willing to do commercially, all of this stuff, right? I don't see, because I didn't really understand last year, like why you would seriously entertain replacing Russell with Verstappen. Like, I understand why you'd want to make sure you knew if Verstappen was available so you could actually weigh it up. But I wouldn't then, my decision at the end of that wouldn't then be to bin off Russell for Verstappen when you've got Antonelli coming through, because you don't want to because then you're jettisoning one potentially mega driver and world champion, and you're potentially compromising another just to get in Verstappen, who certainly as we're looking at 2026 right now, having Verstappen in that car versus the other two is not going to change the likelihood right now of a Mercedes driver winning the world championship. So it just doesn't seem entirely necessary. So if that remains of interest to Wolff to seriously consider Verstappen, it's basically 2025, but the decisions or like the reasons to replace one of your existing drivers have only reduced. But like Russell stepped in and immediately got the world championship winning car potentially, and he's doing a very good job. Obviously, China qualifying was compromised, and in the race, the sort of circumstances went again. I don't think he dealt with it as well as he could have done, but so be it. And Antonelli's won a race at the first realistic opportunity of doing it in terms of getting track position and then doing the job. So when you're looking at it like that and looking at what does this mean, what are they proving about themselves, where might the gaps be still to Verstappen? I don't think the gaps are big enough really to justify dumping either of them.
The question would also be, Verstappen has said many times he doesn't like these cars and it doesn't matter if he's winning or not. I'd really want Mercedes to kind of put that to the test and know if he means that. Because imagine if they move heaven and earth and get Verstappen for, say, 27. Like you say, they have to get rid of either Russell or Antonelli. They'll look really silly, even if Verstappen goes on and wins. If he then walks away at the end of 27 or 28 because he absolutely hates these regulations and stuff. So I think they'd need an absolute guarantee because, yeah, it just feels like it would be an act of self-destruction. And to be honest, at first, I was definitely in the camp of they should go all out and get Max because he's Max Verstappen. But they have such a solid, well-balanced lineup now with actual proper potential for both drivers to grow that for me, it would just be a massive, needless risk really to go in on that. I think it's time to finally, for Toto Wolff to just, put a pin in it and say, look, this is done. Maybe one day it will happen in the distant future, maybe in a different form. But I think he could draw a line under it and say, look, I've explained the reasons before. It maybe even made sense in the past. But right now, I'm incredibly happy with, one of the best drivers not to ever fought for the title in George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, a potential future megastar who's really showing that potential, and just say, I'm incredibly happy with these two drivers. I'm incredibly happy with how the team's going. Enough is enough. I'm not going to go after Verstappen anymore because even now, when you get asked about it, it's still kind of a little bit on the fence and a little bit leaving the door open still, when I think it's time to shut the door on that one.
Wolff's always been someone who doesn't want to come across disrespectful when he talks about drivers in those scenarios. Do you remember a few years ago when he was very, very politely entertaining the possibility of Sebastian Vettel being in the running for a Mercedes seat when he got dumped by Ferrari? Wolff had no intention of signing Vettel. Like there was basically no chance of doing that. But he was a four-time world champion. He's someone who's held in incredibly high regard in the paddock. Wolff wasn't just about to rudely shut the door in his face, and there will always be that little part of him, as he admits, that sort of ruse on the Verstappen side, losing him, a dozen years ago and missing out on him there. So I don't think he'll ever quite bring himself to fully eliminate the possibility, but he's got everything he needs right now to just, in a very Toto Wolff way, very firmly but politely, close the door 99% of the way, because there's just no need to make a change. Certainly not on the evidence of two races in which Mercedes has very clearly won both of them.
Yeah, the trouble is, I think any team would move heaven and earth or be inclined to try and move heaven and earth to get Verstappen. He's a bit like the position Ayrton Senna was in the early 90s in F1, where basically everybody wanted him, and there's an extent to which you take the opportunity and then you sort out all the knock-on effects, even if it means you have to bin an outstanding driver. However, I do wonder if actually, when you look back at the whole thing, maybe it was actually the start of this year that was the better window of opportunity if Verstappen had managed to extricate himself. But it didn't look like that at the time. So I'm not saying that's a mistake or anything. But yeah, I think it would create, like you said, it was a champagne problem. Scott, I still think there'd be a part of Wolff that would quite like to do it, because any team would want Verstappen. So I think probably Verstappen future talking points will start to get louder in the coming months.
Plus, it's also worth pointing out that the data that Mercedes will have on how the drivers are actually performing will outstrip anything that we've got and what knowledge that we've got of them. You can only judge the drivers on what you see, and when they have the best car that wins by 25 seconds over the next car, like it was in China, even with a safety car and whatever, then there's a big win. Like, there's the margin for error within that is actually really large. So this is completely hypothetical. This is not based in any kind of reality at all. But Mercedes data might show that actually there were a dozen micro mistakes over the course of the second half of that race. That means actually the computer tells them the winning margin could have been 30 or 35 seconds. Now, it matters not in that scenario that it isn't, but like if you're giving away 5 seconds in race time, for example, or you think that one of your drivers is giving away 5 seconds in race time, where the possibility of sniping for Verstappen comes in is if you are planning for a situation where those 5 seconds is the difference between winning a race or not. So that will be the sort of thing that Mercedes has in mind when it comes to its drivers.
There's also the question of your investments. Obviously, a lot of has been spent on Antonelli and Russell. So if you look at them and you don't have concerns about either's performance, it would be a slightly strange business decision to break the bank to get Max Verstappen over your homegrown ones. Now, again, I'd still say Verstappen is the best driver in Formula One. He is the driver everyone should want. So I'm not really coming at it from that perspective. But there are a lot of factors that, if it becomes a real possibility, that they need to work through. But connected to this, we've got a question now for you, Josh, from James Godfrey Moon, who says, I think George Russell still has the pace on Kimi Antonelli, but it looks like it's going to be the two of them competing for the title, at least in the early stages of the season. Mercedes are very cautious of having two number one drivers. How do you think they'll handle the team politics?
Yeah, I can't think why they're so cautious. I can't remember if they've had any history of having two number one drivers and it not going so well. But yeah, obviously they had 4 years of Nick Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton, and Wolf often brings this up pretty much. He's asked about it a lot, and it's still very fresh in their mind. Look, they made mistakes, and it was a very harrowing time. Even though they came away with so much silverware, it was not the kind of atmosphere that they ever wanted to repeat. But the circumstances are completely different. Hamilton and Rosberg were friends and had a whole pre-existing relationship before they came to Mercedes, and obviously that blew up in a very spectacular kind of personal way over those years. I don't see the same thing happening with Antonelli and Russell. It seems like a much more kind of not professional, colder relationship, but kind of they're in very two different phases of their career. Russell has been there for many years. He's ready for his title challenge, and Antonelli's only in his second year. And even their kind of characters doesn't feel like there's going to be massive friction there. Of course, you never know until the drivers are actually in a title fight how they'll react, and I'm sure there'll be a crash. There might be a team order dispute later in the year. There could be all these kind of things that are inevitably going to crop up. But I kind of see it going the same way as kind of a Norris-Piastri way. I don't see it exploding in a terrible way. There might be odd flashpoints, and I'm sure the drivers would be annoyed. But at its kind of worst, I feel like it's going to be the kind of Norris-Piastri. And then I guess at its best, in kind of inverted commas, that this might not even be a thing, because I think Russell still has the edge on Antonelli for this year at least. We need to see weekends where they're both in play, because in China, Antonelli, I think, did a properly good job, and it was a proper win, but Russell was compromised in both qualifying and the race. So if Antonelli goes on a run and has some weekends where he's going head to head with Russell and is beating him, then yeah, I'd say Antonelli's a title contender. But at the moment, I would say he's only a title contender in the fact he's got a car capable of winning the title. I'm still not sure if he is, because he's only in his second year. And of course, we might see that in the future years. But right now, that problem might not even be a thing, because it might not even be an intra-Mercedes title fight.
I think what you said there about the difference between Russell and Antonelli I was going to pick up on that in relation specifically to the McLaren comparison last year, because with when it was Hamilton and Rosberg at Mercedes, obviously it had been a while that since Hamilton had won his world championship, but he was a world champion. They both were race winners, and there was probably a sense at the start of it that obviously it was only going to be between those two to win that championship. But at least by that point, you had one driver was a champion. There was they were at similar-ish phases like through their career. They had a lot of backstory as well. It was quite a layered dynamic between the two of them. With Piastri and Norris, you have a much closer kind of thing to Russell and Antonelli, in that was a battle between two drivers going for their first world championship. believing that they would get more chances, but knowing in their heart of hearts that they might not, and that might be the best chance they ever get to be the Formula One world champion. That could be the same with Russell and Antonelli now, but with the crucial difference that Russell probably has enough to keep Antonelli at arm's length over the course of the season. He should. If Russell gets beaten by Antonelli this year, that would reflect very poorly on Russell. Antonelli's a very, very good driver, could potentially become an outstanding Grand Prix driver and multiple world champion, who knows? But he is, as Josh says, in his second year in Formula One. So if Russell can't bring everything together now to beat Antonelli, if they do have the best car over the year, then that's a failing on Russell's side as much as it would be impressive on Antonelli's. So yeah, I would lean towards it being on that McLaren side, because I don't think it's a world apart in terms of the way Mercedes wants to go about things versus McLaren, and that was key to keeping the Norris Piastri stuff sort of as mellow as possible. But I just think situationally it's different enough again that would just help ease. There will be flare-ups, I'm sure. I'd be amazed if there aren't flashpoints, but it should just sort of, the natural dynamics of the situation should help.
Yeah, and interesting how Mercedes will handle that, because obviously McLaren got so much flack last year of, keeping everything fair. I'm interested to see, will Mercedes take the same approach? It seems like they're happy for their drivers to race, but in terms of strategy, inevitably there's going to be a Hungary moment where there's going to be two different drivers on different strategies and one will win. So I'm interested to see how they'll play that. But like I say, it will depend how much of an issue it is. Of course, one lesson from McLaren is that you need to bank the points while you have a good car. So they can't afford to be keeping everything completely fair between the two of them at the expense of points, because as we said at the start of the podcast, this could all change and a Ferrari, a McLaren, a Red Bull could enter the title fight as well. So it's all about just banking the points as possible. And from a very cold perspective, they would probably prefer one driver, be it Russell or Antonelli, just get races into a decent lead and builds on the advantage, while Mercedes has the fastest car.
In terms of handling it for now, they won't do anything beyond just saying, look, don't drive into each other. Don't let your battles compromise the team's result. Where I think it could get interesting is if Antonelli starts bothering Russell regularly. That's when I think you could get something interesting happening, because I think Russell will know that he needs to try and pull rank a little bit. He'll probably try and do that. And if he feels that Antonelli is getting on terms or risks getting ahead of him, I think he'll think, oh, well, with the long-time links with the young Kimi Antonelli and the Antonelli family with Toto Wolff, he'll start questioning that. And I can see that pushing Russell into a zone where he feels, rightly or wrongly, he should start to react and do things. So that's the one path that could lead to something interesting. But I agree with what you said, Scott. If Russell finds himself in that position, he's in a bit of trouble anyway, because really he needs to be keeping just that little bit of clear air, at least between himself and Antonelli. Right, let's move on to the next question now that I will take from Luke Sherman, who says, has there been any talk around the paddock about figuring out how to move the energy management to something more in the driver's control versus being run by the algorithm? It might still have issues, but I think we might see some more interesting stuff on track once the drivers wrap their heads around it. Not really. The problem is there's so much stuff that has to be automated because of the regs and that kind of thing. You could put more of it in terms of just you push the button and you're deploying, but there's times when you're not allowed to deploy, when you get into power limited pending modes and all these sorts of things that mean it's just not really realistic to be able to do that. So I think the way these have been conceived means it's too late to do that. If you were conceiving the regs and you said, right, we want to make this whole system entirely driver controlled and push button controlled, you could start to think about it. But that also means the drivers have to think about activating super clipping as well as deploying. Are you deploying at 350 kilowatts or a reduced amount? Are you harvesting? Are you lifting and coasting? By how much? All these kinds of things. There's so much complexity in there that I don't think it's really reasonable. We're coming back to the Alonso Battery World Championship comments there, aren't we? You don't want it to be so extreme in that regard that they're doing that, but they are looking at it. But I think just trying to put it all straight into the driver's control is quite an appealing idea, but I think it just breaks down as soon as you look at the realities and the complexities of the technology. Right, next question now for you, Scott, from Adpo. Is Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc's flagrant disregard for workplace safety flattering the supposed raceability of these regulations? That obviously alludes to the Great China fight they had.
Well, I think, as Hamilton put it after the race, there was they managed to do a lot of it without trading paint, and then he switched the analogy slightly and said it was just a little kiss when they did get a little bit too close. I think actually what that showed was something that could, I don't know if it could be done, but maybe is the way in which these regulations can be saved in the short term, which is if you can fiddle with the regs, and I'm sure there'll be engine manufacturers and teams that are massively against this proposal because the engine side is a big part of Formula One, and many people argue maybe should be because it's part of the technology and whatever. I think we've got such an aggressive influence on the engine from the engine at the moment on everything. If you can find a way to basically massively reduce the differences between the engines and their behaviours, I think what you saw between Hamilton and Leclerc could potentially become the template for how good F1 2026 racing could be. Because I have a suspicion, and I might be completely wrong on this, I'm more than happy to have evidence put to me that this is absolute nonsense, but I have a suspicion that the fact that they're in exactly the same car and exactly the same engine with basically identical deployment options, whether it's automated or manual or whatever, that has to have played a part in how good their racing was. It cannot be coincidence that the racing between those two is the best that we've seen, right? And that's what gave me such heart. That's why I took so much heart from what I saw at times in China. So if we could just all agree, and we won't, but if we could just all agree that the engines, there's too much variance between the engines, and yes, manufacturers should be rewarded for doing a great job with the rules, but the rules are too flawed, so I'm sorry, but this is just the way it has to go. And you found a way to basically try and constrain the manufacturers so that the charging and deployment demands are such that pretty much everybody's working in a much narrower band rather than this big variance. I think some of those good elements to 2026 with the cars being slightly lighter, slightly smaller, slightly more nimble. I'm not going to pretend that there's been a complete transformation in F1 racing or anything like that, but I just think that there is reason to be encouraged by that side of things. So could that Hamilton-Leclerc battle be the way that other cars are fighting with each other? The problem is you have unintended consequences, which is that if you took away the massive variance in the way that teams and engines are doing things, you're probably going to have more of they wouldn't be DRS trains anymore, but you'll have more of the trains come back because people can't just blast their way out of position just by spending a bit more energy in a different part of the circuit. So, I'm not saying that the engine shouldn't count for anything in the regs. I wonder, because that Hamilton-Leclerc fight did send my mind down like a couple of different interesting avenues in terms of what is this actually telling us about the 26 rule set. So I don't think it oversold it. I think it just sort of showed us the upper end of what it could be, what it could be. And I would just like to hear some, detailed analysis basically from the teams, the FAA, whatever, on, right, can we harness that and make that a bit more of the template?
I think the big problem is you can almost use that battle to make whichever case you want because we don't have enough data. You could say it flatters the regulations because almost the counter of the point you've made there, Scott, is that because they're the same car, they can pass and repass each other without there really being a definitive battle outcome almost for a long time because they are the same car. And when you deploy a bit more here, you regain it and you just end up sort of effectively in the same place. And you could then point to some of the midfield battles between different cars not happening to support that. But I don't think there's enough data to be to come up with particularly strong conclusions on that. So we don't really know for sure, which is interesting insofar as we're going to need more races to really learn that. What it does tell you is in terms of raceability, and what a lot has told us is that it does make it easier to get wheel to wheel and to get ahead of people and to get back past, etc., which has positives and negatives. People have their own views on it. So it definitely tells us that. But I think we have to be really careful about using that as confirmation bias because I can build you probably an equally compelling case on both sides. And that tells you we don't 100% know as yet. Right, Josh, on a related topic, Joe Fitzsimmons says, did the very close but clean racing between the Ferraris compared to the racing further down the grid, which resulted in collisions, show the skill difference between midfield and front-running drivers when it came to wheel-to-wheel battles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, look, the quality of the Leclerc-Hamilton battle was fantastic. It was great to see both of those, racing toe-to-toe, especially having seen Hamilton so, kind of neutered by a woeful year last year. It was good to see him back to his best the weekend. But no, I think it says a lot about Hamilton and Leclerc. I mean, I think both are very good in battle, very, clean drivers, but you can have examples of that throughout the grid. People like, I guess, Alex Albon, Fernando Alonso, we've not really seen those drivers ever really crashing into people that often. And even Hamilton and Leclerc have had their incidents as well. So no, I don't think it was reflective of that. It was just a really good battle, but there's plenty of drivers in the midfield who would be capable of having a good battle like that. But yeah, fair play to them for having, it must have been a nervous time for Fred Vasseur and the Ferrari pit wall, but thank goodness they were able to keep it clean, because I think it just shows that, you can just let drivers race, because it would be really easy for Ferrari to go, let's just call that off and have the cars come home third and fourth, because there's no threat in front, there's no threat behind, let's just call it off. But they gave the drivers some freedom and they really kind of, took it nicely. It's a different game though, because obviously they're fighting with the same team. Someone like, the Ocon Colapinto crash is the first one that comes to mind. That's a mistake from Ocon. It's, he's a driver fully capable of having amazing defensive moves, overtaking. He's pulled off, I think, some of the best moves of the ground effect era before. So just a bad day for Ocon and a very good day for Hamilton and Leclerc. But you could point to something like Brazil last year where Hamilton, clipped the back of Colapinto and he held his hands up and said that was a mistake. So yeah, it was a good day for those two and a bad day for some of those in the midfield, where inevitably there are more rookies anyway and less experienced in battle. So yeah, it's a bit of a coincidence, I think, on this occasion.
That does feed into the next question I'll take from Anthony Rullamo, who says, do you think teams will be more wary of their drivers battling each other under these rules? Feels like you're potentially wasting a lot of battery power in a battle, while the driver behind the battling teammates can just harvest and wait for his moment to strike. I wonder how it would have played out if there was a driver in P5 threatening the Ferraris. That last point's very important, because Ferrari, they weren't really going to beat Mercedes and they had a huge gap to behind, so they could afford to battle and lose time, and it didn't really make any difference to their overall result. If the McLarens had been there, they'd have been closer, so maybe that would have changed things. But definitely, I would be concerned about drivers battling and losing time, because it's not even just you're deploying versus someone behind you's harvesting, who might be able to pounce on you both, but it's a question of, you want to get that there's an ideal kind of battery strategy around the lap. So it's not just whether you're using or charging at a given time, it's what your overall battery state is and the knock-on effects around that. That's why it's such a three-dimensional challenge that impacts, around whole lap. So I'd be concerned about that. And I do think, as we've seen from those early races, I mean, look at the way, particularly in Australia, initially it was Russell and Leclerc, they were battling. Then it was Russell, Leclerc and Hamilton, and they were battling. And then it was Russell, Leclerc, Hamilton and Antonelli. So that kind of tells you that does compromise your lap time quite dramatically. So if I had two teammates in a battle and there was somebody close, I would be wary, and there'd be times where I just want to say to them, just don't do that, try and get away, then sort it out later.
I think the main thing was that it just showed that they weren't particularly bothered about, or didn't have any false pretenses about keeping Russell behind. Otherwise, there's just no way that you'd be sacrificing that. Although I guess you could argue, as Russell kind of alluded to afterwards, that was probably the best way to stymie him and stop him getting by, because the cars were just going side by side in so many places. Russell was just sort of sat there as I'd describe him as a begrudgingly entertained spectator of that fight, where he was just like, I should get out of the way, but this is also quite good to watch.
It's also an example of what games can be happening in the midfield too, because I think both Haas and Alpine were kind of playing the game to a certain extent. They had Pierre Gasly and Ollie Behrman obviously in good positions, and had Colapinto and Ocon a bit out of sequence. And both of those drivers were kind of used to kind of back up the pack. And I feel like you can almost have a kind of, a few games going on in the midfield, which is good because it's all part of F1 and we've seen it before. But with this battery deployment, if someone has a penalty, if someone is compromised, if someone hasn't pitted yet, you can kind of sacrifice, one driver to help another and kind of, waste away your battery and take a few more risks just to keep cars behind. Because if you get overtaken, you could just use all your battery and try and get back past and then just slow down that car. I mean, look how much time at the front, Russell lost, fighting the Ferraris. So it can make a huge difference.
Now, we've done lots of talking about the racing also in our content for the Race Members Club. 90% off your first month of membership. That's a special offer that's on at the moment. And it's been a good chance for us to work through some of this stuff and speak to our most committed fans, shall we say, both in terms of our videos, our F1 Extra bonus podcast. There's a chat community there. Scott, it's been particularly valuable, actually, in the early stages of this year, all the stuff we've been doing there, hasn't it?
Yeah, because this is a time where the fan discourse is one of the most important metrics, if not the most important metric. And there are elements to it where it's so divisive that you're never going to get everybody to agree. Certainly, even within the members club, I think we have the most level of kind of division or difference of opinion that ever. But it's a great place for people to be able to share that, and there are elements of it as well where we gain something from it, because it's not a one-way street. Like we engage with the comments because it's a better community than just sort of in the wild of wider social media, shall we say. And that's quite good, because then you can have back and forth, and if someone wants to challenge the way that we frame something or view something, they can do that. We can go back to them, and then they can either tell us that, oh, actually, I hadn't considered it from that perspective, that's interesting, or they can double down and say, yeah, but what about this? And then actually it's you that changes the opinion slightly. But then, and obviously beyond that, there's the more conventional kind of back and forth in the form of like your driver rankings, for example, which are proving wonderfully divisive at this time, because by your own admission, the rank, like working out the driver role in the performance at the moment, is really, really hard. And the members have particular drivers they're fans of, study them very closely. And I think in the first 2 weekends, from what I've seen with some of the questions you've been getting, there's definitely been I would say like a slight ratcheting up of the level of detail that some people are following drivers' weekends in, to be able to say, well, actually, no, like this is what they're doing. And one of the things that we started in China, actually, and we'll do again for Japan, is for the Champions tier members, like this, they're now getting their chance to rank the drivers, so they can go toe to toe with you and see what life is like in your shoes, Ed, when you're trying to make sense of which order to put the 22 in.
Yeah, exactly. And what I do like is that there's a very popular British politics podcast that uses the phrase disagreeing agreeably. And I think that's quite an important thing in terms of the members club, because it doesn't always happen out in the wild. So that's probably one of my absolute favourite things. Even if you've got strong disagreements on things, for the most part, people understand they're all enthusiasts for the same reason, and you can try and focus on the debates and the arguments a bit more rather than it becoming unpleasant. So that's the positive thing. But 90% off your first month to get a feel for what the Race Members Club is like. Hit the link in the episode description, or head to Patreon, search for the Race of the Race Members Club to find out more. And now on to our final batch of questions. Scott, from Elliot Davison: is the Haas genuinely the fourth fastest car on the grid?
I don't think it's necessarily fourth fastest, but I think, to build on something that I said a bit earlier in the season, like, it does feel a little bit Williams 2025 to me, in that I feel like it's either going to be the best midfield car or the second best midfield car in a lot of places. And that is more often than not going to put it in that kind of P7 to P10 region, because there's unreliability, there's also inconsistency in performance from some of the top teams as well. Obviously, McLaren vacated 2 positions entirely in China, but Red Bull was just a genuine sort of lead midfield car in China, rather than completely in the clear. So it was being out qualified and out raced on merit, and that's kind of the place I see Haas in. I would. One of the things I want to do when I'm in Suzuka is just understand a few more sort of specifics about the strength of the package, because the problem is the way it gets talked about at the moment by us, but also when you hear like driver feedback or what the team are kind of saying, is it's kind of broadly in line with what we said in pre-season, which is just like it just seems like such a nicely unproblematic car in the midfield, or package in the midfield, like all round. And that's just like, especially for Ollie Behrman, Ocon would have had a better result in China had he not made that mistake against Colapinto. But it is allowing the drivers to just be like at or very close to the upper limit of its potential more often than not. And there's a bit more variance going on, not just in the midfield, but around the grid.
Next question for you, Josh, from Alexander Law. For the customer teams of Mercedes, especially McLaren, would there be thoughts about looking for a works engine partner? It seems that we are starting to go back to the rise of manufacturer teams again, and the customer teams are just not going to be able to be consistently competitive in the future. There was a rumour for a big Chinese car manufacturer considering F1. Would that be a long-term path for a team?
It all depends on how this year shakes out and next year, because right now there is a big deficit between supplier and customer, but will that change as the year goes on is the big question, because we could get to a scenario whereby the end of the year or next year, it is quite similar and that gap has closed. And in that case, it's a bit of short-term pain. McLaren, I guess, has lost out. It feels for the first time that it's a disadvantage as a customer team right now, because Mercedes is going into every session kind of knowing what to expect. They can get the data and then check it against it. Whereas McLaren is a bit more unsure because it doesn't have that kind of huge foundation of knowledge. So it's very much kind of reacting to what the data is telling it kind of after the fact with not so good predictions. And as Andrea Stella said, that's not how you work in F1. So yeah, for me, the question is how will that change? And then in terms of alternatives, I think going with a brand new manufacturer would certainly be a big risk. So I think for now, it makes sense to stick with Mercedes. Did have one crazy thought the other day, but kind of a Honda reunion once Honda sorts itself out. If Aston Martin isn't interested in a few years, would be a dream scenario. But those are so far in the future yet. I think we need to see how it plays out, because I think that McLaren is still more than capable of podiums, wins, and a championship even within this year. So way too early, I think, to be working out whether or not they need to change their path.
Yeah, I think basically teams will always want a works engine partner if they can. But what they don't want is a less good works engine partner than if you're a customer of a really good power unit manufacturer. So they'll always be on the lookout for that. And of course, BYD was the Chinese manufacturer that had been linked. Right, question from Gustav Smith. When we see a graphic of battery percentage and the overtake is on, is the percentage then of the standard battery capacity or the overtake mode capacity? In the former case, could we have more than 100% battery? It's a good question, but it sort of misunderstands for very, very good reasons, because this has not been well explained. The battery percentage is always of the 4 megajoule battery capacity, because the battery capacity is always 4 megajoules. When you get overtake mode, that doesn't actually give you any extra battery energy. It gives you the allowance to get an extra half megajoule harvested per lap, and it allows you to deploy at maximum power when others are ramping down at high speed towards the end of straight. So that's the overtake mode itself. So it never actually gives you any more energy to deploy. It allows you to deploy a bit more power when others are ramping down, and then that extra half megajoule you still have to harvest yourself within the 4 megajoule battery. So you're not gonna straight away have half a megajoule extra. You're allowed to harvest it.
I was just about to say, Ed, that's a really, really good job of dancing between all the different numbers and stuff there. One thing that is probably worth stressing very specifically, because you mentioned being allowed to harvest that little bit of extra. There's a slight difference, isn't there, between that, the 4 megajoule capacity of the battery and that harvesting limit. That's a slightly different number, isn't it? But it works within that capacity.
Exactly, yeah. It's normally 8.5 megajoules per lap. In a race, you can harvest, and you're allowed to do 9 if you've got overtake mode on that particular lap. Right, a question for you, Scott, from Miles Mason. Is it possible mechanically and legislatively for F1 to increase the power output of the ICE to improve the issues associated with the electrical energy, superclipping, lifting, coasting, yo-yoing, etc.? It seems like a simple fix, but I'm not by no means well informed on the subject.
Well, you can probably correct me on this immediately, Ed, if I've got this completely wrong. But I think this is where some of the suggestions about increasing the fuel flow come in, right?
Yeah, the fuel flow you could up to an extent, and that will help a bit, but you then do run into problems with how much fuel capacity you have in the car, because obviously you design around it. And also there's a point where you can't just keep infinitely putting the fuel flow up, because it has design implications. So there's little things you can do.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the main thing I've heard on the combustion engine side. I think you have different ideas. McLaren's, for example, is to have some kind of combination of allowing super clipping to, when you charge the battery by super clipping, you can run the MGUK fully at 350 kilowatts in reverse instead of the reduced 250 kilowatts, which is where it's limited to. When you lift and coast, for example, you can use the MGUK at the full 350. So the argument is, let's super clip at that as well. But they suggested maybe do that in collaboration with maybe bringing down the amount of electric power output in race trim. So whether that goes down to 300 kilowatts or 250 kilowatts, I don't know. And then rather than up the internal combustion engine's power output in itself, it would be increasing the ratio of the total power output from the V6 versus the electric side in race trim. And the argument there would be that you've got a little bit more opportunity, a little bit more flexibility to recharge with the different methods. But then because you're deploying less electric power in terms of maximum capacity each lap, it's less of a stretch to make it work, which means you're having to do less of the aggressive stuff in theory, because you have less to use when you want to use it, so you'll be draining the battery less. I don't really know where they're going to land, to be honest. Obviously, this is going to be a big discussion after Suzuka. There's options, and they've got different ways that they can do it, but there's pros and cons to all of them. So it's going to be very, very political as the FIA tries to work out who's advocating what for what reason.
Josh, question for you now from Richard Randall. Given Melbourne made those track changes to open things up a couple of years ago and to suit an outgoing regulation set, is it now worth reverting that circuit back to its former layout to make the best of these regs?
I think on the grounds of costs and logistics, probably not, after all the effort that went into that. And to be honest, I kind of like it as if, I'm interested to go there next year and the year after and just see how different it is, and almost use Melbourne as a bit of like an evolution of these regs, of kind of how much better are they? Because, right now the cars are very energy starved there. But I reckon it could be a different story in a few years, and Melbourne will probably be quite a nice example of that.
And the final question I'll take, this is a combined question from James Smith and Stuart Coulter. James Smith's is sort of the first half and Stuart Coulter's is the second. Are people really struggling to understand this format? It seems very easy to follow, even without the battery graphics, which are fun, but definitely not something I'd want on screen all the time. It's pretty clear when one car is deploying more than another just by watching. And is FOM reluctant to show the battery state of charge when two cars are battling for position? During the Sprint and Grand Prix, it felt like they were being selective as to where and when these graphics appeared on screen. I'm not saying that the graphics are needed on screen 100% of the time, but they should be available whenever two cars are battling closely so that viewers can understand the dynamics of the racing between them. Yeah, there were some data problems in China, so I think there's a benefit of the doubt there. I would 100% agree that whenever you've got two cars battling, you do need the battery state of charge, and it needs to hold for a reasonable period as well, because in terms of the understanding, I don't think people are struggling to understand the fact that if one car's blasting past another, they're probably deploying and the other isn't. But why you need the battery state of charge up reasonably sustained is you need to know that you need to see the patterns where the trade-off is. Okay, he's deployed a load there and passed, but actually on the back straight, he's got 40 percentage points less than the car they're battling with. So that's why I think to really understand the full scope of the battle, I think you do need the battery there, because it's not specifically in the moment. It's what does it mean? And let's say you have, for the sake of argument, a really good 10-lap constant battle of George Russell and Charles Leclerc changing places. You kind of need, if it's always happening, the battery there all the time so that you can see the patterns and how things change and how attacking in a different place changes the picture and how drivers are forcing their rivals to deploy. And sometimes it'll be not just forcing rivals to deploy to stay ahead, but actually to pass. And all of these things, I think, to really understand the battle you need. And I think F1 should absolutely embrace it because it's interesting. And I think some fans will just sit back, ignore the little battery graphic. That's fine and enjoy it. They can do that. Others will really want to understand as much as they can about what's happening. You need to serve both. And just for two cars, having a couple of state of charge permanently there, I don't think is a problem. And I think actually is a necessity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's too much of a dependency on the battery in terms of understanding what's going on and its influence on key race situations, that having it there at all possible opportunities makes a lot of sense. We've seen the impact that in Australia, when you had these confused messages over the radio about drivers starting the race with no battery or minimal battery. We've seen restarts where Russell gets swamped by the Ferraris, for example, in China. I would have loved to have been able to follow that super closely, whenever that happens, rather than just in sort of isolated situations. But I think also just in terms of, for us and for any fan watching, just to be able to fully understand the stuff you were talking about a little bit earlier, Ed, with the fact that you're constantly you're constantly deploying and recharging the battery, because I think I'm not suggesting that a lot of people watching Formula One also watch Formula E. The Formula E numbers are too low for that to be the case. But if you watch a Formula E race, for example, there comes a point where there's a big energy reveal and you see what battery people have got left. But in Formula E, you're working from a 100% battery down to 0 by the end. That's the journey that you're on. So you kind of have that in mind, and that frames the way you judge the rest of the race. I'm not saying that this is happening all the time, but in Formula One, it can be very easy sometimes to remember that it's not about who's draining the battery as the race goes on. It's really framing it as how critical it is lap to lap. And then I think that would also lend some sympathy to the discussions that are going on about why is this so hard? Why is this such a big talking point? Why does this have to happen in qualifying at the moment? And then when you do start to see improvements as technology changes or the regs are refined or whatever, then everybody kind of understands that better. And I don't see the issue in doing that. I definitely think you can have a nice balance here, as you say, Ed, where a casual fan who isn't necessarily, and I'm not saying casual in a derogatory way, but just someone who can watch it without needing to be fully invested in what the battery state of charge is, because it's really just the visuals of the car on track and they're happy kind of working it out from there. Everybody consumes sport in slightly different ways. So you can have that side of things, because a bit of a battery information is not going to make or break it for them. But then for the majority, I think anyway, of fans, especially when we have this argument all the time that F1 should be about the technical side and the technology side too, that's what the manufacturers want, blah, 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 then we need to be able to buy into the idea that the fans care about it as well, and that they want to know and that they're capable of understanding it. There's no point in trying to dumb it down. Like, give them the information at a sensible level, and then let them do with it what they want. Because the people that don't care about it and don't want it, they don't have to use it. But the people that do will have it.
Yeah, and if there was any reluctance by FOM to put it in the broadcast, there absolutely shouldn't be. I would say, you need it to be a crucial part of it. You don't need to have everybody's state of charge constantly. That would be too much. But my feedback to FOM, and in fact, I did give F1 this feedback after the sprint race. Yeah, if you've got a battle on track, you want to have the state of charge sustained while that battle is going on. Anyway, thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Remember that 90% off your first month's membership of the Race Members Club offer is there if you want to get involved in asking questions. And thanks to Scott and Josh for your answers. We're going to keep on talking. We've got a Lewis Hamilton-focused podcast coming up next, provided something else doesn't arise to change that. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.